particularly in their 20s and 30s, think this is the most important agenda item. Support for the alliance is very strong in the US and in Australia, but when you ask younger Americans and Australians what should we be working on as allies, it's what affects their future. It's climate change. And so we're thrilled to be able to have two of the leading experts on the topic to help us think through the issues that we should be discussing together as allies. Let me first acknowledge the traditional owners of Australia. The University of Sydney, as you all know, stands on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. We're thrilled tonight to be joined by two people with a close connection to the U.S. Studies Center and the U.S.-Australia Alliance, in addition to their expertise on climate. On my far left, physically, not politically, is Lachlan Carey. Lachlan is a senior associate at the Colorado-based Rocky Mountain Institute, RMI, where he leads work on U.S. regional economic development through clean energy investment. He previously worked at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, where I also spent 15 years before coming here. Most important, he's an alum of the University of Sydney and the U.S. Studies Center program of teaching and research. Meg McDonald is a former senior diplomat. She's now a board member of the New South Wales Net Zero Emissions and Clean Energy Board, the Foreign Investment Review Board, the FIRB, and the Environment Commissioner at Greater Cities Commission for New South Wales. Meg has over 30 years of experience in public and private sector life in Australia and in business as a diplomat and as a business leader. Meg and I met each other first when she was DCM charge at the U.S. Embassy in Washington some time ago. She was a very important figure and had already served at that point as Australia's ambassador on climate change. And so brought that agenda with her when she worked in Washington. So I'm going to ask both of our guests a couple of questions, and we'll open it up, take some questions from the floor, and see where we go. Let me actually, I guess you're our honorary American, Lachlan, since you've come from Colorado. Last place I was before I came here, by the way. Did some good trout fishing and.
I'm actually based in DC. We've got a couple of.
Okay, well, that's where I was born and raised. So did not catch trout as big in that Washington area as I did in Colorado, though. So let me start with you because you're just here back in Sydney. We'll talk about the COP meeting in Egypt, but just to focus on the American situation, President Biden has embraced this agenda in a way, of course, President Trump did not, but now you have a Republican-controlled House. The Inflation Reduction Act was passed, which is a huge piece of legislation. Just help us get situated first by capturing, if you could, the sort of politics and policy trajectory you see right now in the U.S.
Yeah, so I think, to put it simply, I think it's all going according to plan. President Biden came in, they knew they had 2 years to legislate their agenda. They had the American Rescue Plan, a huge fiscal stimulus, which included a bunch of climate spending. They had the bipartisan infrastructure bill, also included a bunch of climate spending. Chips and Science bill, and then finally the Inflation Reduction Act, the big go-to. Together, we're looking at over $500 billion worth of climate spending across those 3 or 4 bills. And so yes, that's trillion with the T, which averages out to about $80 billion a year between now and 2030. So we're talking about really significant numbers here. And so as I said, they had 2 years to legislate, and then they knew this is what happens in American politics. You get the midterm elections, the House flips. They probably expected the Senate to flip as well. We didn't see that, so that makes a big difference. And so then the remaining 2 years of this administration is all implementation, implementation, implementation. And that's what they're focused on, and I think that's what they'll continue to do.
So Meg, putting on your old DCM hat again and your industry hat, and of course all the commissions you serve on now, looking at where the U.S. is heading, what does this mean for Australia? Are we aligning? Are we poised to do more together, given the tailwinds now behind the Biden administration's approach to climate?
Well, I think it's interesting to hear Lachlan describe the moment, because in fact it is very much that moment here in Australia as well. because you've got a federal government that's just been elected in the last, in April, come in with a very big agenda on climate and knows that it's really got a lot of catching up to do after 10 years of climate wars, perhaps even longer, and a very clear determination to make the type of, take the sort of domestic action that is necessary without the ability to actually impose a carbon price and do any general economic instrument, because that has that's
off the table now.
That's off the table. No one would dare. So it's really using all the instruments that we've got and consolidating a lot of the action which had already been taken on the energy front, renewable energy front, by a lot of the state governments to actually get Australia, keep the lights on and get Australia on the road to being based on renewable energy. So this is the moment where cooperation between the United States and a new Australian government probably offers its biggest opportunity from a climate change perspective. But I'd also add on that the whole geopolitical situation is one which is driving us much more to be thinking about the security of supply chains, particularly in the whole renewable energy sector, and really thinking about how to engineer this industrial revolution that it will be based on a clean energy economy. So that's very much where the federal government is really putting a lot of emphasis with its legislation, its budget, and its whole industry policy for the foreseeable future. So it's a great time, but it's not being engineered under the name of climate. It's actually being engineered much more as an industrial and economy repositioning.
So the geopolitical challenges, the war in Ukraine, the supply chain interruptions, OPEC movements, are driving some commentators to say now's not the time for action on climate because energy prices are high and so on and so forth. But what you're saying is actually, no, that politically, that actually makes it easier to make the case for secure supply chains and less reliance on imports of oil and gas and so forth. Is that right?
And when you look at the fact that we have an ageing coal fleet, we're going to have to replace those regardless of climate needs, and they're actually very expensive. So the increase in prices of coal on the export market as well as gas has actually driven up the price of energy in the market. And renewable energy, solar in particular, of which we have an abundance, is now the cheapest form of energy that we can get. And it's interesting that as an opportunity for consumers, it's actually put solar on your roof and you've actually developed your own supply chain. And so that's really a lot of what is driving a lot of the policy in Australia, thinking about that for the long term. And it deals with this whole energy security issue and decarbonises and really renews the economy.
I was promised a lot more solar than I've gotten since I arrived in August. There's been a lot of rain, but your point is exactly right. Australia has a unique benefit in that regard. Lachlan, where do you see the politics on the what I think will be the rub between the Republican Congress and the administration, which is the nature of the energy transition? You know, the leadership of the key committees in the House, the relevant committees of jurisdiction that touch on climate and energy and so forth, they're not climate deniers for the most part, but they are advocates of gas and oil and coal because they argue that, you know, renewables can't provide the base load that, you know, if you take all of the renewable energy available in the world today, it gets you a couple days of energy production, so on and so forth. So where do you think the debate is going? It's not about climate denialism that you had with the Trump administration versus climate urgency. It's really about the nature of the transition. How do you think that debate will unfold in the US? And maybe, Meg, you can tell us how you think it'll unfold in Australia, and we'll see if there's an alignment.
Yeah, well, I think in both countries we're seeing energy costs being the focal point here, right? So you had the Albanese government come in saying we're going to deliver $275 savings on your electricity bill. That was, you know, possibly a political liability now, but at the time a very successful message. You know, it wasn't an accident that they called it the Inflation Reduction Act, not the Carbon Mitigation Act or something. It was specifically about lowering people's energy bills. and you look at the policy provisions in there, it's tax credits for renovating your home, it's tax credits for building renewable energy, it's tax credits for making hydrogen cheaper. It's all directed at lowering energy costs, and that's a big political win. And we saw that in the midterm elections. I mean, this was a midterm election without any backlash on the most historic piece of climate legislation
It's amazing.
in US, arguably world history.
Yeah.
I mean, this is only 12 years after the Waxman-Markey bill and the Tea Party revolution that spent over $1 billion in advertising trying to slam the Obama administration for its climate policies. The last look that I've seen, it was exactly $0 spent on attack ads on the climate provisions in the Inflation Reduction Act. That is an unbelievable shift in a country that, as you say, has typically been marked by climate denialism, or at least climate policy delay. So I think the politics have really shifted here. And another key reason for that is Bloomberg did an amazing analysis on the Inflation Reduction Act and the benefits of how they'll be distributed within the US. And it's overwhelmingly within red states. And so I think that makes a huge difference. So just today we saw First Solar, which is America's largest solar manufacturing company, announce its largest expansion in its history. Where's it doing it? It's doing it in Alabama, a deep red state. And so that totally changes the politics when you see that there are these tangible economic benefits. That's jobs, that's capex, that's potentially exports. That totally changes the way that you frame and think about climate change. In terms of the actual effects of this midterm election, I think there's still some uncertainty in the Senate, which will actually make quite a difference. Right? The Georgia runoff, the difference between 51 and 50 seats, makes a big difference on who heads up these committees.
Who chairs committees,
How easy it is to pass judicial and nominees, which there's still quite a few in sort of climate relevant spaces. So that's one to watch. And then in the House, as I say, I don't think they're going to try and roll back the IRA. But what we are going to see is a lot of oversight. They're going to look out for their next Solyndra, which, for those of you who might remember, was a large loan to a solar manufacturing company during the Obama administration. It went belly up. Republicans had a field day. Fox News had a field day about this is, wasted government money, et cetera, et cetera. Don't mind the $500 million loan they made to Tesla, who then went on to become the world's most valuable car company. But Solyndra failed, and so they're going to be looking for the next version of Solyndra. So expect to see Jigar Shah, the head of the LPO, up there, in House and Senate committee hearings, and expect to see the head of the Securities and Exchange Commission as well. I think they're really going to attack the Biden administration on climate-related financial regulation.
Yeah, and another area where we might anticipate some pressure on the Biden administration is the debate over LNG and so forth. I mean, John Kerry's position on LNG is not the Secretary of Energy's position on LNG. There are some clear inconsistencies within the Biden administration. What do you think the future is, getting right into the personnel and gossip of, former Secretary of State John Kerry and the whole narrative the administration takes out on things like LNG or coal?
Well, I think the administration's been pragmatic, and that's been a really useful solution politically. So if you think about its use of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, for instance, to try and make a difference on gas prices, it's shown that on the one hand, it's willing to pursue this so-called all-of-the-above energy policy and still try and expand oil and gas production, while on the other hand, really trying to push renewable energy forward as well. So I think they'll continue to do a bit of on the one hand and on the other, and that might be a little hypocritical, but I think that's, as I say, when the key issue is energy costs, it's the only way to deal with it.
Megan, in the U.S., one other factor that may be behind this, in addition to the important electoral politics of which red states benefited from the IRA, behind it may also be the role of states and the private sector in embracing climate friendly policies and business practices. Is that also the trend in Australia? Do you see, you do a lot with the New South Wales government, is a lot of the innovation happening at the state level and by firms because of, some level of paralysis in both our countries at the federal level?
That's exactly what's happened. As I said, nearly every state has had to really take much more accountability for and spend much more money budget-wise to actually drive energy policy because of the history, in fact, that it's state governments that actually have the legislative responsibility for provision of energy, and actually traditionally the energy generation was a state-owned business, actually, and it was sold off in different ways, but the states that have both retained that ownership, Queensland and Western Australia, are actually moving fastest to decarbonise the energy generation because economically it actually suits them, but equally both of them are very rich resource states, Western Australia gas, Queensland coal and gas, so they're really able to play both sides of the fence really in maximising the opportunity from the transition. And in Victoria, we've actually got a situation where the state is renationalising to actually bring back state control of generation and assets. So there's a lot of action, but it's been driven out of necessity because of the age of the fleets and also the heavy carbon intensity of the generation system and the costs that imposes. But that's also driven by industry, and in fact very large industry is demanding renewable energy and setting it up, the opportunities and actually funding their own sources of renewable energy. So some of the very big users are actually doing PPAs that actually act as the financing basis for some very, very large renewable energy developments, and they have actually accelerated the pace of that large scale and also helped drive down the costs for the rest of consumers. So I don't see that's actually going to be reversible by any future government because of the way in which the prices have gone. Now, here in New South Wales, where I spend a lot of my time, the big issue is what to replace state income with when the coal royalties go. So it's an echo of what is the case in individual states in the United States as well, which is one of the reasons why I see the sort of practical cooperation stage that we're moving into in terms of how to engineer this shift to a low emissions economy and also engineer it on the basis of industry. There's so much that both countries have got to learn from the experience. Up till now, we've been very busy setting up the frameworks and getting clear on the tracks to doing it. Now it's actually a race to do it as fast as we can and not actually hit roadblocks. I don't know whether Lachlan would agree, but
I completely agree, and I think this is where global climate cooperation is heading. Much more pragmatic, much more focused on problem solving in individual sectors. And so, climate cooperation for 30 years has been based around how do we find global consensus on this collective action problem. And that was fundamentally the wrong way of looking at it. It's really an issue of distributive conflicts in sort of local political economies. So how do you pay off the quote unquote losers of the energy transition, like coal workers, coal miners, and how do you subsidize the quote unquote winners, green hydrogen, renewable electricity, and so forth. And so focusing industry by industry, what are the barriers, what are the political sort of constraints here, and finding ways of really solving this problem. Because ultimately, trying to find global consensus is a surefire way to a lowest common denominator solution, right? And we've seen that time and time again. I don't expect to see anything particularly earth-shattering coming out of this COP27 this week. Instead, what we're seeing are some really interesting initiatives on the sideline, with industry partners on a sectoral basis, whether it's in, green shipping corridors or hydrogen alliances or the Glasgow Net Zero Financial Alliance. These are some really interesting practical initiatives that I think are going to make a difference, and very few, if any of them, are directly tied to that COP apparatus.
So I have to give Meg a chance to respond because you spent part of your career as the climate ambassador seeking that very global consensus. Do you agree? Do you think that's just not the future? Or should we look to the COP27 and future COPs with higher ambition than we did in Egypt?
Well, one of the big things that Australia is currently preoccupied with is actually securing the right to host the next COP.
Yes.
We're a co-host with our Pacific partners, and so we'll be hearing a lot about what the benefits of COPs will be. Lachlan and I were just chatting, as a veteran of COPs, I will be happy never to see another one. I think they have a place because of the way in which they bring focus not only on the pace that we are actually making the change, and 1.5 really is a big driver.
Yeah.
Even though we're not going to actually hit that, and actually that is one of the big issues at COP. How do we actually stand up and say, no, we're not going to make that 1.5 that we pledged to at Paris? But actually that sort of pressure, I think, is really quite important. And it's very important that global joint accountability is maintained, because there are a bunch of countries still that are actually not really pulling their weight, and that sort of global pressure, I think, is important. But even more important is that it's not just governments, but it's actually all this private sector, all the other actors are actually there, because I actually think that it's finance markets which will actually drive this fastest, because of the liabilities that countries that haven't decarbonised or actually have are laggards will actually face in being able to really raise capital and achieve the sorts of things that they are looking for economically. So yes, I see that there's a real opportunity there to keep that drive for global action, but at the same time, it's these individual sectoral collaborations that also COPs seem to drive too, that are really, really important and highlight what's possible. I think one area where I see still that there are kind of big challenges are where we've got new technologies like hydrogen, the regulatory environment and the receiving environment for enabling these new areas of trade are actually not proceeding as fast as I think are necessary that the market needs. And so that is an area where I think more opportunity for multilateral action to actually get those enabling environments for those sorts of trades to happen. But also being able to really highlight where there are big technology breakthroughs, and that's one thing that the IRA does is actually really targets a whole lot of new technologies that are probably sitting there but really need the kind of stimulus that this is going to provide to actually commercialise them on a big scale. And that sort of technology race, I think, is really one of the things that, again, that I feel is unstoppable, particularly when you've got the kind of stimulus that the IRA holds. But then there becomes big equity issues about how then other countries get access to, can get in to be part of that production chain.
Yeah, I think that's right. But the technologies are global. At the end of the day, you look at what China's done. Ultimately, it was pretty self-interested. That's built up a global manufacturing base in solar, in batteries, in electric vehicles, and we've seen the costs in solar decline by 89% over the last 10 years. Lithium-ion batteries by just as much. And the difference between renewable energy and fossil fuels is that the more renewable energy you manufacture, the cheaper it gets. Yeah. Whereas fossil fuels, it can depend on the whims of a dictator or geopolitical disputes. And so for solar, for every doubling of global cumulative capacity, we see the average cost fall by about 24%. It's about 19% in lithium-ion batteries. And we're expected to continue to see that exponential decline in the cost of these technologies. And so as we see in the IRA, the amount of Green hydrogen that's produced in that country is about to explode. The amount of extra battery manufacturing as they start to prop up a new EV manufacturing industry. So as we see the production of these technologies increase, that technology goes down. Australia stands to benefit from that as the price of our solar panels on our roofs continues to go down, as EVs become more cost competitive with internal combustion engines, as hydrogen becomes a potential source of future energy exports for this country. And I think those global spillovers are really going to be felt, and ultimately the benefits of that I think are far going to outweigh some of the perhaps protectionist concerns that particularly the Europeans have on the IRA as well.
Except, maybe, that those protectionist concerns in the geopolitics are weighing more heavily and will weigh more heavily in future. So yes, China built an impressive solar industry. If you talk to a lot of solar panel former executives in Massachusetts and Texas, they'll say, yeah, they built it by stealing our intellectual property and dumping in our market. If you look at COP27, one of the things that's significantly different from Paris or previous COPs is the geopolitical tension with China and the emissions targets and policies that Beijing is implementing. So we have a big problem with China. It's the largest emitter. It's also the most recalcitrant right now of the major powers. India is racing for that second place spot. So what do you do about the geopolitics? You start with you, Lachlan, and then Meg.
Yeah, so I think we're starting to see different ways of using the regional frameworks, the regional multilateral alliances as sort of ballast against China, and using climate as a really sort of central piece of those frameworks. So the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, for example, is the Biden administration's attempt to sort of find a new version of the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership.
Except you're not allowed to say TPP if you're in the Biden administration.
Of course not. I think it is a recognition that for a lot of people, the free trade orthodoxy didn't work. We saw communities across the US deindustrialize with all sorts of negative consequences, for these communities, not least of which is the sudden support for Trump. Yeah. Not to mention the supply chain resiliency issues and the challenges we face in dealing with climate change. And so I think it's really positive to see, I think they call it the clean energy economy as pillar number 3 of the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. You're also seeing climate touted as the potentially the centerpiece of the Quad. I would be surprised if we end up at that point. But to see an alliance that was set up, fundamentally as a sort of bulwark against China in the region, really embrace climate cooperation as a source of soft power and ballast to really strengthen those relationships, I think is really, really important. But at the same time, China does still, if not be at the table, at least not be working actively against us. They control well over 90% of market share in most components of the solar manufacturing supply chain, for example. It's even higher in certain rare earth minerals that go into lithium-ion batteries. And so we're a long way away from being at a point where Australia, Canada, the US can produce enough of these components ourselves to deploy at the scale and speed that we need to meet our climate goals. And so we need to make sure that we avoid the significant tensions that might lead to those supply chain resiliency issues. And so I think that's where the G20, for example, is a really important forum for us to continue to be engaged. I think the G20 has suffered from a decade of sort of listlessness and not really knowing what its purpose was after the global financial crisis. And I think climate change presents a real opportunity to be the sort of galvanizing force that, the G20 is the world's largest economies, which means by and large it's the world's largest polluters. So it makes a lot of sense for that to be the sort of locus of climate action in the future as well.
Reminds me of the Groucho Marx line, any club that would accept me, I wouldn't want to join in the world's largest emitters. The G20 was successful initially because it was about preventing competitive devaluation of currencies and protectionism. So maybe if there's a role for G20 with climate, it's that. It's preventing bad competitive and predatory and protectionist approaches. What about China? What do you think?
Well, in terms of international cooperation, I think I was very struck by a speech that the Energy and Climate Minister Bowen gave to CSIS.
Our old home,
yes,
right?
in September, which was a very pointed description of where the strategy was for Australia, which was it's not healthy for us to have the major supply chain concentrations that we've near monopolies, he called them, for us, and that one thing that our recent history has taught us is that if we need to expand these industries at the pace that we have to, then it pays to have diverse and robust supply chains from many sources. So I think that was a very, very clear message, not delivered by a foreign minister or a prime minister, but actually under the guise of a climate. So, and if you again look at what the new Australian government has done, it's very quickly moved to put in these bilateral cleaner energy agreements built around securing supply chains with Japan, for instance. It's about reassuring Japan that we're going to continue to provide gas, but it's also about the supply chains for rare earths and battery materials, and really beginning that sort of investment process. And we're also doing the same with India. So it's a very interesting time to be seeing how this sort of network of bilateral alliances, as well as the G4. So what do we take from that? That this is not vocally about China, but it's actually about a very learning from the experience of Australia's recent past, that our can't be left open to coercion in a way, and left vulnerable around key supply chains where we think we can be actually a major player because we've got a lot of those assets.
When the Japanese and the Chinese clashed 10 years ago now in the East China Sea over the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands, and rare earth metal exports to Japan were embargoed in violation of the WTO, the Japanese government went from about 90% to 50% dependence pretty quickly. But getting from 50% to zero is almost impossible. It's a very tough problem, but clearly, as Minister Bowen said in Washington, as you hear in the Quad, even in AUKUS, I mean, there's this, this focus on secure supply chains. And it's going to be tough. The debate about China and climate has been a little bit stupid for a long time. The progressive left for a long time was saying, look, climate is so existential that it will allow us to transform relations with China. It will crowd out all geopolitical tensions or tensions over human rights because we all have to live on the planet. And, at the beginning of the Obama administration, many in the believed that and had a very unsuccessful COP meeting with the Chinese as a result, because that's not how Beijing saw it. On the other hand, you have on the right this argument, we can't trust China on anything. And so let's not work with them at all on climate. And somewhere in the middle, we're going to find what that sweet spot is. Because as you point out, both of you, we cannot leave ourselves in the Australian or American political system, Japan, open to coercion, but we can't ignore China because of the points that Lachlan makes. And I think we're all kind of trying to figure out where that sweet spot is.
But there's a lot of opportunity for cooperation with China, but both multilaterally, but also in the other forums like G20, etc. So there are opportunities, and we should be using those, but not actually leaving ourselves hostage.
And maybe the answer is what we were discussing earlier, that change in the politics of climate policy did not happen at the federal level in either of our countries. It was states, it was local communities, it was NGOs, it was business. And maybe that's how we ought to be thinking about engaging China on climate. Not at the, you take it to a Xi-Biden meeting, and Xi Jinping's response is going to be, great, stop selling arms to Taiwan. It immediately gets caught in other geopolitical issues. But maybe if we can do more at the firm, grassroots, state-to-state level, practical things, we'll make progress as well.
I also think there's an important human rights component to this that's often overlooked. I mean, pretty much all the world's polysilicon gets processed in the province of Xinjiang, with arguably the use of slave labor, and overwhelmingly in coal-fired power plants. So the polysilicon we're using as renewable energy, is pretty carbon intensive. And so the quicker we can move away from that, I think 67% of the world's cobalt production, which goes into lithium-ion batteries, is in the Democratic Republic of Congo, which uses child slave labor. Australia has about 20% of the world's cobalt reserves. I think we currently only produce something around the order of 4% of annual production. So by ramping up cobalt mining and cobalt processing in this country, we're not just contributing to the resiliency of the supply chains in clean energy technologies that we're going to need in order to decarbonize, but we're also potentially displacing child slave labor and sort of contributing in that front as well. So I do think there are multiple sort of points here where it's pretty clear that, as I say, this sort of hyper-globalization that has defined the last sort of quarter century, that we need to move beyond that and be thinking about supply chain fragility, decarbonization, human rights, and a broader set of concerns here.
We're about to announce, just a little advertising, at the Study Center next week. We're going to announce a new program and a new director and expert on economic security looking at supply chain and energy security. So stay tuned. I want to come back to the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act. The most significant investment in climate by the US federal government probably ever, and the biggest piece of industrial policy ever, since World War II at least. And I've heard two things here in Australia about it. On the one hand, that was incredibly impressive. And this really is a model for the world. Who would have thunk that the United States would do this for how to get the federal government innovating and supporting innovation. But I've also heard people say, this is a problem for America's friends and allies. This is industrial policy. This is federal subsidies. This is going to get the best and brightest going not to Australia or Japan or Canada, but to the US. So there is still a competitive, if not zero-sum dimension to climate. Are you worried about this, Meg? I'll start with you in an Australian context. Australia does not have a similar approach yet, but are you worried that this will have, competitiveness?
There is quite a lot of concern, but in different areas to that I've seen from the European. There's now like a formal dialogue between the US and EU around dealing with some of the competitiveness concerns. Where it really is of I think concern for Australia is as a producer of hydrogen, for instance, and things like sustainable aviation fuels, whether hydrogen-based or other, where there are those sorts of explicit subsidies, it really changes or raises the bar for Australian producers. And you know that we have some very big investments going in hydrogen across the country, and big investments in the technology. So those are areas of concern. But again, it's a question of how fast we can actually provide that niche for ourselves and find our part in this new economy. But it is causing investors to really think long and hard about what those impacts are going to be, and that's where there could be some investment diversion. But on the other hand, I think as beneficiaries of the kind of technology breakthroughs that Lachlan was talking about, there's a lot of optimism that that's going to force some the pace of technology change, and we will actually be beneficiaries.
So it's virtuous competition at the end of the day, you think?
It's a mixed bag.
Okay.
It's a mixed bag,
Yeah.
Depending on where you are
Yeah.
in the production chain. But I do think that on a skills basis, it is going to actually draw a lot of skills immediately into the United States. But that becomes something that should be a matter for urgency already for all of us, because it's a complete skills race anyway, for all of the areas where we're trying to decarbonise and re-engineer our economy for a low carbon base.
What's your take?
Yeah, so first I'd say we've always had an industrial policy, both Australia and the US, right? In the US, its industrial policy was to promote healthcare and the financial sector for the last quarter century. In Australia, it's been to promote mining and the housing sector for the last, however long. And so, it's just been that we decided that manufacturing was an area where we didn't want tariffs because we wanted to see the price of our TVs go down. And so we let China produce all our TVs for a while. Well, eventually that's come back to bite us, and we're starting to correct. So on the one hand, I think industrial policy, it's always been sort of part of how we've driven our economies in the sort of right direction. And then the second thing I'd say is, this worked politically. I mean, just to step back for a second, as I was saying earlier, this is a country that not that long ago, half the Congress outright denied the existence of climate change, and somehow in a 50-50 Senate with a bare House majority, the Biden administration managed to pass $369 billion worth of climate spending. The best estimates we have suggest that that's going to lead to about a gigaton a year of lower CO2 emissions by 2030. It's about a 42% reduction in US emissions compared to 2005 levels. A gigaton, to put that in perspective, is larger than the annual emissions of all but 5 countries on the planet. So by 2030, the US will be eliminating whole countries' worth of emissions thanks to this bill. And I think the industrial policy elements of it were critical to its success. Yeah. Right? And so that's the key thing here, that ultimately industrial policy is political pragmatism. It's about saying, how do we sell climate change to voters? Well, you sell it by promising them jobs. You sell it by promising them lower energy costs. And fundamentally, to do that, you need to use the tools of industrial policy. And so those tools are identifying strategic sectors, creating frameworks and incentives to move those sectors towards targeted goals, and then allowing the private sector to really do the experimentation, the innovation, do its thing in a sort of capitalist competitive way to, as I say, drive down the costs, expand production, and ultimately invest in these clean energy technologies. And that's what we've seen in the IRA. And so I think a lot of countries are going to learn from this experience. I think Australia definitely should learn from this experience, because we have very similar political environments. We both rely quite a lot on fossil fuel production in our economies, much more than our European counterparts, for example, who are overwhelmingly fossil fuel importers. So that totally changes the political economy of the situation. And so I think, this element of how do we reshore manufacturing jobs? You're already seeing Labor's, $15 billion National Reconstruction Fund. That's an industrial policy fund is what that is. Mm-hmm. And so, I think Australia's learning these lessons. The way the Albanese, campaign was run was very similar to the way that the Biden campaign was run on the issue of climate. Biden, on the campaign trail, liked to say, when I think of climate, I think of jobs, 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 right? That was how he was highlighting this. That was how he was selling this. And so, as I say, I think Australia is absolutely learning those lessons.
That's fascinating. And I think in both countries, it's not just the Democratic Party and the Labour Party, it's the Republicans and the Liberal Party are also changing in really profound ways on this issue. As you pointed out, there was no attack on the IRA in the midterms. There were other bigger targets, of course, but still, it tells you something. The other big piece of industrial policy that passed in the Congress was the CHIPS and Science Act, primarily written by a Republican, Todd Young of Indiana, a Reagan Republican free market guy who got the Venture Capital Association to endorse industrial policy because they said there's not enough venture capital. And then you look at sort of the emerging conservative, meaning Liberal Party and Republican leaders, love them or hate them. In New South Wales, the most dynamic young politician is championing climate policies and climate-friendly energy policies in this state. The biggest Republican winner in the midterms was the governor of Florida, Ron DeSantis, who some people say is mini-Trump, some people say smarter than Trump. But people are also saying he was, as a governor of Florida, pretty serious about climate policies, invested a lot of money and time.
A lot of great things for rooftop solar.
Yeah, so a lot of good sun in Florida too. So it's interesting because you're seeing conservative politics when you look at the next generation of leaders also talking about it very, very differently, which is encouraging. I mean, that sort of points to convergence, maybe.
But it's exactly as Lachlan says, they're the people that can see that it's an industrial, because of the failure to actually prepare us for this sort of economic change at the speed with which it's going to be necessary. particularly given in the Australian case, we're actually feeling the impacts of climate
Yeah.
already, and therefore a lot of the types of actions that we're going to have to take are ones which have resilience as well as mitigation benefits. And I think the other thing over the history of the time that I've been working in this area, 15 years ago we thought, Waxman Markey, we'd be able to do it through a carbon price, and that this sort of very overt intervention in the economy was not going to be the way in which we would deal with it. And similarly here in Australia, in both cases, the economist's dream turned out not to be feasible politically, and so this journey through to a different way of engineering the same economic result is really where we're both at, I think.
Yeah, and I think carbon pricing showed itself to not just be a failure politically, but I think from a climate standpoint as well. I mean, you look at the EU and they have a cap and trade mechanism. Okay, that sounds great, but you know, the price that they have in that system is orders of magnitude below the best estimates for a true social cost of carbon. So we've never gotten close to what that would really look like. And it's not a coincidence that Tesla came out of America. It didn't come out of Europe. And it was, as I say, the DOE Loan Program Office, fundamentally an instrument of industrial policy that really, you know, catered the way for Tesla to innovate and really disrupt the car market. That wouldn't have happened on the margin, which is fundamentally how carbon pricing works.
And now Elon Musk is showing his appreciation of the Democratic Party at Twitter, right?
And I would say here in Australia, you know, in the absence of a carbon price, the introduction of interventions like the Clean Energy Finance Corporation and the Australian Renewable Energy Agency have done had the same sort of impact in being able to drive forward technology and drive down the costs and actually create these industries with very, very direct interventions, but actually to great benefit. And really, when you look at it, the CFC pays for itself. And it actually makes profit. And ARENA has overall only cost us about $2 billion over 10 years. So that's really an example of where the costs of these sorts of interventions are actually very small when they're very strategically done and very smart. And I think that's what we're seeing now with the IRA. It will be very, very targeted and very, very cleverly thought through. It's a really smart piece of policy, I think.
Well, as Winston Churchill reportedly said, you can count on the Americans to make the right decision after they've made all the wrong decisions. And the trend we're talking about is encouraging. We see, I think we agree, convergence between the left and the right in both the US and Australia, and convergence between the US and Australia at state government bilateral levels.
Perhaps not the far right.
In either, no, I mean, look, when you read the far left and far right on climate in the US, it's as polarized as ever. But the IRA showed that the middle's getting bigger. The question is it enough? And let me turn to the last issue for us before we open it to the audience. Given everything we've discussed, what would you put on the agenda? What would you advise Prime Minister Albanese or President Biden in a bilateral context to do on this subject at Osmond in a few weeks, and in the Quad Summit coming up next year, G20 and so forth? What can the US and Australia as allies do in this space to make progress? Yeah, go ahead, Meg.
Well, I was just going to say, since the Albanese government has been in power, we've actually signed 2 big agreements with the United States, all based on technology cooperation and this strategic investment, but particularly in renewables and battery precursors and also direct air capture of all things. So there's already an agenda being set out there, which it hasn't really been made public as an agreement, but it is actually very, very clearly an agenda built on making this an integral component of our overall alliance. And so, and that's that's Minister Bowen's words around what that means. So I think it's already there as a central part of the agenda, and I think making sure that we've got that close-knit cooperation, particularly where it's investment between that's going to be mutually beneficial.
Yeah.
And knitting together those supply chains is going to be really the most important thing that I would be looking for to get out of that agenda.
That's good.
Yeah,
What do you think?
so I 100% agree with everything Meg just said. And I'd just add, I sort of see three buckets here for how to think about US-Australia climate cooperation. The first is, well, what can we do from a climate change perspective just to maximize the amount of emissions we abate? And to me, the key things there, first and foremost, is coal. Right, coal is the dirtiest fuel, and it's the fuel we need to get to phase out of the fastest. And I think here Australia is still a real laggard. Just yesterday, the G20 announced this Indonesia Just Energy Transition Initiative, $20 billion worth of grants and loans to Indonesia to help them get off coal. Conspicuously absent from that agreement was Australia. The US was a part of it. So I think that's an area where Australia really needs to step up. Obviously, the political liabilities are a big issue, understood, but facts are facts. Second key area where we need to work on is these hard-to-abate sectors. So that's about a fifth of global emissions. We're talking steel, cement, fertilizer, these sorts of very energy-intensive sectors. And here too, Australia, I think, is behind the eight ball. For me, one of the most important initiatives in this space is the First Mover Coalition, which is a bunch of governments and companies saying we're going to be the early market in, innovative technologies for green steel, green cement, and so on. Again, Australia isn't really a part of that. Fortescue and Rio Tinto are, so some Australian companies are involved, but not the Australian government yet. And the third area is innovation, and here Australia is playing its part. Mission innovation to me is the sort of key forum there. The second bucket of areas is ones we've already spoken about, and I think that's the regional alliances, particularly vis-a-vis China. So Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, G20, APEC, and so on. And then the third are the bilateral engagements, where it's really, as we've spoken about a lot today, what are the pragmatic problems that need to be solved? And here there's a bunch of areas where I think Australia and the US face really similar problems, right? Transmission being a really big one. Bowen likes to say we can't have a transition without transmission. And, they're aiming for, I think, 10,000 kilometers of new transmission lines across the country. It's a huge task. And we're seeing, the potato farmers in Victoria, like how much of a challenge it is to obtain, this so-called social license to build these lines in people's backyards. People don't want big, ugly power lines in their backyards. And so that's going to be really difficult. And fundamentally, you can't get the solar from where it comes from to where it's consumed without transmission. And the US faces exactly the same problems, with permitting reform and so on. And so I think that's an area where if we can figure out best practices and share those, that would be really important. And then there are areas where, Australia's a leader in rooftop solar. 1 in 4 households in Australia have solar panels on their roof. The US is way, way behind on this front. This is an area where Australia has really sort of pragmatic advice that I think it can share with its US counterparts. On the inverse, the US is way out ahead of us on things like EV charging infrastructure, smart grid technologies. And so I think these are areas where we could really benefit from really targeted forums for sharing best practices with utilities, with local governments, and so on. And so I think that's where, as Meg was just saying, we're starting to see these very technologically specific partnerships develop, and that's where I think a lot of the action is going to be going forward.
Can I add one more to that is cybersecurity, because actually as we move to this decentralised grid and the multiple generation sources, actually cybersecurity is one of the biggest challenges that we are going to be facing with managing this whole network of technologies, let alone the fact that we'll be moving into more autonomous vehicles. And so really our systems are more vulnerable. That's a whole huge area that I think is ripe for the kind of collaboration that Australia and the United States do best.
Well, you've given the US Studies Center and the audience a really rich agenda to think about for the coming year. I'd add one more quickly and get your thoughts. Meg, you may recall, and Lachlan, you as well, that during the Obama administration in APEC and other fora, there was discussion of a green goods and services agreement. Now this gets back to the tariff reduction approach to trade agreements that you and I grew up with. But I would think in IPEF, a real mark of success, if the US Trade Representative's Office, the Biden administration, can get over its TPP allergy, a real mark of success would be if we had in that pillar of IPEF actual reduction of tariffs for green goods and services to really encourage exactly this kind of technology transfer, investment, and trade. I don't rule it out myself. I wouldn't bet on it in the next year, but my view is that trade politics in the US are not locked in stone. Our surveys show that 60% of Americans said TPP was a good idea. Problem is, ironically, most of them are Democrats. Republicans used to be the party of free trade. But when you ask just generically in our survey, should the United States do more to promote trade and investment in the Indo-Pacific, you get very high numbers, including people who voted for President Trump. So it's all about how you frame it. Mm-hmm. And I would think in IPEF there's a shot at that kind of progress, because reducing barriers to trade and in goods and services in this area would spur cooperation.
I totally agree, but I think the other area, particularly in this opening up of trade, is around uniform standards and really being able to accelerate the homogenisation of standards across areas, because that acceptance, a large part of the process and the cost of actually rolling out a lot of these technologies is the approval processes that you have to go through across different geographies, and also the testing and being able to do something to actually speed that up and to make sure that we have that greater recognition would actually be much more beneficial, not only for the producers, but very definitely for the consumers.
And that's politically easier than traditional market access type agreements. Yeah.
I would just add, I think the WTO is part of the problem here. You know, their focus on, again, finding global consensus, reaching, lowering tariff barriers across the board has really held them back on things like regional trade agreements, where the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework is what it should be aiming for, where, as you say, you harmonize regulatory standards within the framework, and you say, if you meet these standards, then we will reduce tariffs in these environmental goods. But my impression is that the WTO would frown on that, and so I think that really holds back IPEF and similar arrangements' abilities to be flexible and to encourage, to have that carrot as well as the stick here, and so I think the WTO needs to reform just as much as the UN framework on climate change.
Unless you used an environmental exception.
Well, then we're getting into...
which was actually the thing that got me out of trade into environment.
Interesting. Well, look, we're describing, in some ways, the failures of governmental and intergovernmental organizations designed with 1950s software, and why so much of the innovation is happening in the other areas we've discussed. Let me open it up and see if people in the audience want to make observations or ask questions. I think we have, a microphone. Pretty broad agenda, actually, so fair game anywhere in the topics we've discussed. Please, could you quickly tell us who you are? And
hello, I'm Matt. I talk about this with friends quite often, people saying, oh, we need to do more, we need to do more. Yeah. How much is on the individual person or the consumer as opposed to the corporation? Like me changing my lifestyle in quite small, insignificant ways compared to a large corporation actually making significant difference. Does my little difference actually help? Or is it really, at this point, it's not up to me, it is up to the higher ups to actually be doing their jobs properly? My
vegetarian 12-year-old daughter reminds me every time I have a steak that I'm hurting the climate, the environment. So yeah, it is individual, I think, but what do you respond?
I like the way that the Australian engineer/climate advocate Saul Griffith thinks about this. He wrote a book called 1 Billion Machines. So essentially, to decarbonize the world economy, sorry, I think it's the US economy, we need to replace 1 billion machines that use fossil fuels with 1 billion machines that are overwhelmingly electrified. Now, a lot of those machines are going to be held by utilities, right? They're coal-fired power plants, gas stations, and so on. But a lot of those machines are what consumers buy. So the next time you buy a stove, make it electric, don't make it gas. The next time you buy a car, try and get an EV, part of that is corporations and government incentives to make those EVs and electric stoves affordable. The next time you renovate your house, think about, an electric heating system and an electric, heat pump, exactly, and putting rooftop solar panels on your house. So really it's about the machines that we buy as opposed to the plastic bags that we use from a climate change perspective. That's obviously important from an environment and sustainability perspective, but I really think about who are the actors that are making decisions around these big machines, energy consuming machines, and that's fundamentally where the real climate action is.
I'd agree with that. I think it takes both, and it's some of the shift to renewable energy, for instance. That's the single biggest thing that we can do to decarbonise the system. But there's still a whole bunch of some of the areas that Lachlan mentioned earlier. But it comes down to what a whole bunch of individual choices making a market, and therefore that responsibility for individual choice, whether it's when you're buying your appliance or whether it's the way you're buying your packaging, what the food that you're buying, or even the way in which you're travelling. If you're making those choices, if 1 million of us make the same choices, then it makes a big difference, and the market is created, and it becomes a self-fulfilling circle.
And I would just add that eventually we want to reach the point where you don't have to make the decision on sort of climate change grounds, right? Like the reason Tesla is successful is because they make faster cars, not because they make greenhouse gas free cars, right? And so I think that's going to be true of a wider range of options. So eventually we're going to reach the point where you go to McDonald's and you can get the Beyond Beef Quarter Pounder and it's going to be cheaper than the regular beef Quarter Pounder. And at that point, people are going to make that decision because and it's a pocketbook decision. It's not I'm doing my bit for the climate decision.
Although the branding doesn't hurt Tesla, right? I mean, at least where I come from in Washington, D.C. or Maryland or Virginia, people who drive Teslas like them because they're fast and cool, but there's a certain amount of prestige and branding to it as well, don't you think? And it sells, in other words. You can sell
Sure,
this.
but
brand.
he's very actively getting into the pickup truck market. He's very actively moving his next gigafactory into Texas because he knows, Republicans buy cars too, and the way to do that is to sell them on, the specs of the car rather than the specs
point.
of its exhaust pipe.
Yeah.
Well, I knew that Teslas were going to be huge when a driver that we were using was pulling a Tesla brochure out of his glove box, talking to my then boss about how fast this car went. Now, I had been looking at a Tesla as being, the EV climate solution. The driver was into, this is the experience of a lifetime. Never had anything like this for a rev head. So I knew then that was going to be the thing that would actually take it through.
This is in Sydney?
Yep.
I've been driving in Sydney for 3 months. I haven't had that many opportunities to drive fast yet.
No, well, exactly. It's the takeoff speed.
Yeah, please.
Hi, I'm Phil Frost. We've had more than 20 years of renewables denial at federal level and state level, I think. It's basically led to 20 years of failure to put together any coherent policy around, how to transition and what we need to run a network and transmission system that's going to pick up all this, diffuse rooftop solar and anything else. How do you go about addressing that, and what happens and how long is it going to take before we get a national, credible energy policy for renewables?
Well, I think I would agree with you that it's been a decade or 15 years of stop-start. But in fact, what I would argue now is that each of the states has taken this responsibility and have developed their own plans. The new federal government now, with its Repowering Australia and the transmission fund and the other funds that it's setting up, is piecing together something which will complement that. But I think the thing that is missing is market regulatory reform, which will actually speed that up. Right now, the kind of market mechanisms that we set up with the national energy market are actually acting to slow this process down and forcing it to fragment. And people are going around it through big firms actually doing their own PPAs and funding their own sources of renewable energy when the actual market wasn't providing it. So do we have a coherent market? We will have, and I actually think that blueprint is there now. It's just going to be a bumpy ride to get there because of the speed with which we now actually have to do this, particularly the transmission piece of it.
The point I suppose I'm driving at is that in the absence of a coherent national policy framework, it's very, very difficult for investors to come in and put their money into something, because the last thing you want to have is one policy in Queensland, another policy in South Australia, which don't overlap and become impediments to investment for somebody who wants to make big licks of investment, and then find that actually that won't work over here, but it does work there, and then that market's too small. So you get another set of impediments to investment, which is ultimately where all of this needs to, where the rubber hits the road.
I mean, you're right, and I think that's one of the reasons why we've seen these big plays for the incumbents as a way for big money like Brookfield to come in and actually be able to fast track this process. But it's not perfect, but I think we're moving towards that, and particularly the kind of big auctions that the New South Wales state government has been doing for the renewable energy zones is designed exactly to create that sort of framework contractually, so that no other government is going to come in and can change that. And the New South Wales government's a Liberal government. A Labor government is only going to be looking to do this faster than the current government. So I accept your point that it's not perfect, but I think the market is playing out in a way that investors are really finding it a very attractive place to be.
I'll just add that I think we've hit some really important inflection points where, you know, a lot of these technologies are now cost competitive in the way that they just weren't 10, 20 years ago, right? As I mentioned, solar's fallen in price by 90% in the last 10 years. So, you know, the first utility scale solar plant in the US was only built in 2010. So we're still very, very early into figuring out what this looks like. It's a totally different energy system when it's distributed with highly concentrated, you know, consumer centers. And I think, you know, the IRA and the technology changes really put us at this point where it goes from being something where governments had to fight against industry to something where industry is really pushing for this, where decarbonisation is now seen as inevitable. It's a matter of how fast rather than, you know, if. And so I think that fundamentally changes the sort of dynamic around industry pressure, you know, how quickly we're going to see regulatory change and how much investors are going to want to get into this space.
And that regulatory change is really looking to lower the cost rather than, because the current regulations actually force it at a higher cost than it can actually be. But I do think the big thing that unites, where there's a whole lot of things to be learned, which is what you mentioned, Lachlan, is the big asset of rooftop solar and really how that can actually play in a new energy system. I think we've got a lot that we can actually learn from the individual US states which have very, very high levels of solar penetration, like California, about how we can actually cooperate to understand the technologies that it takes to actually orchestrate and use those resources in ways that we are still experimenting with.
I think we'll also look back and see Russia's invasion of Ukraine as an inflection point here as well, honestly, where, if you look at the 1970s oil crisis, there was a step shift in energy consumed per capita in developed countries. We figured out how to be much more energy efficient because we didn't have alternative technologies. We just had to figure out ways to tighten our belt with the existing technologies we had. Today, now that we're seeing, similar, not quite the same, but similar disruptions in global energy markets, we have alternatives, right? We can build out wind and solar. We can, we've got some of the energy storage solutions, still not the long duration energy storage solutions that we need. And so I think the acceleration in clean energy uptake, it's just going to be dramatic from here. And I really think we're going to look at this particular period in time, the combination of significant US action and Russia's invasion in Ukraine as being the moment where we saw a real step shift.
Other questions? Please.
Hi, I'm Helmut. My question is that you've spoken a lot about industrial policy that's kind of carrot-esque. What role, if any, do you see the stick coming into play?
I mean, ideally there would be sticks to accompany the carrots. It's just politically very difficult. And in environments where you're able to do it politically, such as California, with vehicle emission standards, I think is a good area where we've seen dramatic improvements. A stat that blew me away the other day is that there's more carbon emissions in California from leaf blowers and lawn mowers than there is from cars. And that's because there are vehicle efficiency standards on internal combustion engine motors in vehicles, but not for the two-stroke engines you use for your lawnmowers. So that's an example where those sticks and regulatory standards have really worked. And so I think Australia, is a case where, we don't have a manufacturing industry in cars. So that sort of changes the political dynamic a little bit. But, it's a sector by sector figuring out where is this politically possible and how can we intervene. Ideally, there'd be a range of areas, but my first sort of approach to this is what can we get away with politically? And if it's just carrots, fine. Let's send them lots of carrots until it becomes cost competitive, and then the market will do the rest.
And there's a whole lot of other areas of stick that we could use but don't. I mean, one that's coming up is for industry across the board through the safeguards mechanism, and really looking at ways of forcing industry to put that carbon price in and make plans to actually decarbonise, because it basically forces forward the investment decisions around new technologies that and new processes that they have to deal with. Another area where the stick counts is actually inefficiency standards, and particularly in the building sector, which no government of any colour has had very much appetite to actually do to the extent that will be necessary to get us to be have climate positive buildings. But we will be forced into that, and I think that's an area where, particularly in Australia, we're technology takers rather than technology makers, and so that's also going to be, the faster that happens in overseas markets, then the easier it is for us to actually force that take up here in Australia too.
One stick that I would add that I think is a no-brainer is methane emissions and methane leakages. Australia is a big gas producer. There's way more methane leakage from gas production than we had originally estimated. We're seeing, these flyover technology, drones, satellites capturing the amount of methane leakage in these gas production facilities. Methane, I think it's 4 times more potent than carbon as a greenhouse gas in the short term. So it's really, really important that, one of our short-term priorities is reducing methane emissions. And there's really no excuse for these sorts of leakages in these facilities. And I think there's a growing consensus around what those standards look like and how to crack down on them. And so I think that's an area where sticks are really starting to play an important role as well.
And it's in fact technology that's come out of the US around from both the satellites, but also this drone measurement that's really highlighting in a more granular way where these methane diffuse sources are, and where you really need to be accounting for them by pinning them down to individual facilities rather than actually fugitive emissions that we can't measure.
And the Environmental Protection Agency in the US has a lot of sticks.
Yeah.
And the Clean Water Act and so forth, there's lots and lots of sticks, not necessarily about emissions per se. It's all around pollution, and some of these bills go back to the 1970s and 80s. There's a lot of sticks out there. I think the politics got stuck because sticks were dividing the Congress and the Parliament, and carrots now offer more significant solutions. But even in California, that stick is the emissions control. California's market is too big, so car producers have to produce to that standard. So some of the sticks, even if they're not federal, if it's a big state like California, set the standard.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Then the producers go and say, make this national because we
Yeah.
want to be able to
Yeah.
operate. Yeah.
It's an interesting question. Let's do one more. Yeah, please, in the back.
This is a question from Pam Drysdale, who's watching online. Is there a place for nuclear energy?
Great question, and I look forward to the answers.
Pam, there's always one. Every one of these, there's always a nuclear energy question. Look, I think nuclear absolutely has to be on the table. It's a zero carbon, firm energy source. And that's really, really important because, if the sun's not shining and the wind's not blowing, you need that firm power. And as I say, we don't have those long duration energy storage solutions yet.
So firm power means the base load.
Correct.
For power plants. You can't rely on solar, wind, or renewables for that base load when the weather changes, right? Generally. Or is that changing?
It's changing
Okay.
too, but yeah.
Yeah.
We don't talk base load anymore.
I'm dating myself.
And so in the US, where they have existing nuclear power plants, like in Illinois, the Inflation Reduction Act did include a bunch of incentives to keep those plants online. That's really, really important. And I think we're going to see all sorts of interesting things like pink hydrogen, so hydrogen produced using nuclear power in those areas, which is going to be interesting to watch. But fundamentally, if you look at the last nuclear power plant built in the US, it was in Georgia. I think it ended up costing about $8 billion, overran its budget and time estimates by years. And so, until I see nuclear power being built at speed and at a cost that's, even ballpark comparable to the types of costs we're seeing for renewable energy projects, it's really hard for me to see it as a solution. In Australia, my cynical view of what we're seeing out of the LNP is that this is another delay tactic for them. By bringing up nuclear, it's a way to set up a task force that'll deliver a report that nobody will read, and then they get to kick the can down the road for a few years. Because, Australia politically is incredibly opposed to nuclear, and I don't see that changing soon. Even if you tried, it would take at least a decade to come up with the sort of robust regulatory framework to do it. Where there is some hope is in what are called advanced small modular nuclear reactors. And so this could potentially bypass some of those safety and regulatory concerns. Very, very early stages for this technology. I think there was news today out of one of the first ones being built in Utah that it too is going to go well over budget and over cost. So again, I'll believe it when I see it. Theoretically, I'm very on board. But day in, day out, we're seeing new solar and wind energy projects being built. The only nuclear projects being built are backed by the Chinese and Russians, and those are for geopolitical reasons, not economic ones. Yeah.
And I wouldn't really have any more to add than that, other than one of the costs particularly for Australia, is we just don't have the technical backup and an industry base to actually support a nuclear industry at this point. And so that just adds to the whole costs. And the cost, if you look at any cost curve for solar and wind in Australia, our land is cheap. We have huge opportunities, and we've got a skilled workforce base growing even as we speak, which is only going to drive those costs down lower. So it's really a race, I think, for the nuclear industry, because if the build out of renewables is such, and the grid and the transmission and the storage pieces are all there, then there won't be a need for this base load anymore. And therefore, the question becomes really academic. Maybe at some stage in the future, it's part of a portfolio mix, but it's really a long, long way into the future.
And the interesting thing about nuclear is nuclear's costs have gone up since the 70s. As I say, solar, wind, these are on exponential, cost curves down. And so it's really hard for, it's not competitive today, and it's only going to be less competitive tomorrow.
So, it's interesting. 10 years ago, this issue, climate, was probably the area of greatest friction between the US and Australia. But what we're hearing today is, as daunting as the challenges are, it's an area of conversion, and there may not be many countries as closely aligned on the way forward or the way we've gotten here as the US and Australia. So this has been a rich conversation. I want to thank Meg and Lachlan and all of you for joining us. Thank you. Thanks. That was great. Yeah, I know.